Hello, I'm Pulice, and this is LA Currents. Our next guest is dedicated to keeping the rich history of Los Angeles alive and well preserved. Ken Bernstein is a principal city planner for the Los Angeles Department of City Planning, where he serves as manager of the city's Office of Historic Resources. He also directs LA's historic preservation policies, serves as lead staff member for the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, and has led the creation of a comprehensive LA Historic Preservation Program. Welcome, Ken Bernstein, to LA Currents. We're so glad to have you on, Ken.
Oh, thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, you're a busy man.
I guess so. Have a lot of help, fortunately.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
But working in a city like Los Angeles, it's never ending. Was preservation and history always where your heart was at, or is it something you sort of evolved into?
Sort of evolved into it. I was always interested in cities and public policy and how cities grew and evolved, and knew I probably wanted to work on those types of issues. Although as a young child, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. I did always want to kind of see the city and see interesting places. I would make my dad take me to the downtown area or the Central Library when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But I thought I was going to really work on urban policy. I didn't know what urban planning really was,
right.
And wasn't necessarily set on a career in historic preservation. But I got a degree in planning and public policy, came back to LA, worked for some city council members, Joy Pikus as an early intern, Laura Chick when she represented the San Fernando Valley, interned for Mayor Tom Bradley, our longest serving mayor. And thought I was going to have a career in general urban planning, and then kind of took a side turn into historic preservation, working at the LA Conservancy and learning from the LA Conservancy's CEO, nonprofit of the largest historic preservation group in the city, Linda Dishman, who has run that organization for 3 decades, and learned a great deal. And all of that kind of combined into, combining my past city service and my historic preservation direction at the Conservancy into ultimately assuming the lead of the city's historic preservation program.
What was the first preservation project you worked on in the city of LA?
Oh, well, at the Conservancy, we were involved in trying to advocate for preserving often threatened historic resources. We were involved during my early years with the Conservancy in trying to preserve the oldest cathedral in the city, St. Vibiana Cathedral from 1876, that had been threatened, and actually demolition had started on that soon before I joined the Conservancy, and we led a successful fight to preserve that, have it adaptively reused as a event space for the city. And then really also working on much of the downtown revitalization, the adaptive reuse, the conversion of historic buildings downtown to housing in the late 90s, early 2000s, generating thousands of new housing units in downtown.
As time has passed, have you found it easier sort of to sell adaptive reuse, to not just to the public, but just sort of in general? There's a need for it.
There is. It's definitely gotten easier. Back in the late 90s, when that first adaptive reuse ordinance went in, there was great skepticism, first of all, that anyone would want to live downtown to begin with, and if so, they certainly wouldn't want to live in an old historic building. And so it really took the success of about 70 projects downtown in that first decade of the adaptive reuse ordinance, about 9,000 units in 10 years, to show that yes, there was a market for this and that people really valued the beauty and authenticity of historic buildings. And then we had a whole new kind of cadre of preservation-minded developers that really came out of that time period and embraced adaptive reuse and the possibilities of our historic buildings in the city.
Sure, it's not without its challenges.
Right.
But the importance of preservation.
Yeah.
Why preserve? Why not just? It would be easier to tear some of these buildings down and start from scratch.
Yeah. Well, I often like to say that preservation is really about managing change. It's not about stopping change from happening or preserving every doorknob of a building.
Right.
It's really, if you think about it more largely, in a dynamic city, and there's few cities that are more ever-changing, more dynamic than the city of Los Angeles, preservation is really a way of keeping what makes Los Angeles Los Angeles in the first place. What are those distinctive qualities, those distinctive places that define our city? And preservation brings as well tremendous value in the urban planning work that we do. Again, our planning work is about planning the future of the city, looking a decade or two out.
Yeah.
And again, we can only really help our cities and communities evolve if we understand where we came from and have that connection. And I often like to cite another preservationist, a gentleman named Tom Mays, who is from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who talks about the value of preservation as being about authenticity, continuity, and community. That our historic buildings have this authenticity, a beauty, a character that can't be replicated with new construction. They give us continuity, that connection between past, present, and future, kind of anchoring us, orienting us in a world that can be increasingly disorienting.
Yeah.
And then community. It's our historic buildings and our historic places that have this reservoir of goodwill built up over decades or hundreds of years in some cases, and that connect us to one another and help build community. So authenticity, continuity, and community, those are values that we get with our older and historic places that we can't replicate with new construction.
Well, and it seems strange that this is kind of a new concept for the United States. When you look at Europe, it's like that's kind of all they do.
Yeah.
You know, there's a ton of just like, no, just leave it. We'll, you know, leave the facade. We'll do something on the inside.
Yeah.
Preservation versus modernization, turning some of these places into things like affordable housing. It does all sort of end up making sense, right?
It does. I think often there is a perception that preservation is pitted against change and pitted against new construction and solving our housing crisis. And clearly we have, as I think all of your viewers know, of course, a tremendous housing crisis. We are the most unaffordable city in the country in terms of disconnect between incomes and rents or home prices. So we have to address our housing crisis, and preservation really can be part of the solution. Again, going back to the idea of adaptive reuse and converting historic buildings to new housing, a lot of that has been successfully achieved for affordable housing, 100% affordable units, and we've been involved with many of these projects with some of our designated historic buildings. The Boyle Hotel in Boyle Heights is a great example of that. It was a late 1880s commercial block, and later became a mariachi hotel facing Mariachi Plaza at First and Boyle Heights, and it now has been converted into 100% affordable units by a nonprofit that works in the Boyle Heights community. And then an addition was accommodated, again, allowing for sensible change, a compatible new addition with 21 additional affordable units. And we've done this many times over. The YMCA, 28th Street YMCA in South LA, designed by the African-American architect Paul Williams. Similarly, now affordable housing, a center of athletics and community for the African-American community, now is an affordable housing complex with a 5-story addition as well. So it's not an either-or choice. We need to look at our historic resources as an asset that we can use to solve the affordable housing crisis.
How does a building get designated as, not just historical, but need to be preserved, and so we're going to, move this way rather than tear it down?
Well, our office is the professional staff for the city's Cultural Heritage Commission, which is the 5-member mayoral appointed commission that makes recommendations to the City Council on what does get designated as a local landmark or what we call historic cultural monuments in the city. And we have now almost 1,300 historic cultural monuments.
1,300?
Going back, our program, I think many people don't know, this program had a couple of our Cultural Heritage Commissioners on last year celebrating the 60th anniversary of our Cultural Heritage Program. LA had one of the earliest local historic designation programs in the country before New York. We were 3 years before New York City, before San Francisco and Chicago. So while LA has this reputation of not caring about its history, we actually were a historic preservation pioneer. So we make the professional staff recommendations to the Cultural Heritage Commission. Anyone can nominate a site as a historic cultural monument. The City Council often sometimes initiates sites for nomination, and the City Council has the last word as well, again, based on our professional recommendations and the work of the Cultural Heritage Commission investigating those sites. So that's how sites get designated at the local level. And we can get into it. We've also taken great steps over a decade-long period to identify significant historic resources in every community of the city through a program called Survey LA.
Oh, okay. What does tell us more about Survey LA?
Well,
what do they do?
Well, that grew out of a long partnership between the Office of Historic Resources, LA City Planning, and the Getty Conservation Institute, and financial support from the Getty Foundation, because we had never, up until that time, and Survey LA began way back in 2006, some of the early preparatory work, we had never taken comprehensive stock of all of our historic resources across the city. Only about 15% of the city had ever been looked at to determine what might be historic, so much of the city was kind of a blank slate for preservation. So Survey LA was really taking that comprehensive look, going out into every community. We did it by what we call community plan area. We have 35 community plan areas in the city, and we phased the project through those, going systematically through those 35 areas of the city, beginning with significant community engagement to have people in each community tell us the places that matter to them that maybe were not architecturally significant or wouldn't catch the eye of our professional architectural historians and consultants helping us do this work, but places that have social or cultural meaning in the community. So we had a great deal of community engagement, and then would send teams out into the field. And the purpose of the survey wasn't just to create a list for its own sake, but really to use that survey information to guide and inform good planning, so that as we are updating our community plans in the city, which are kind of our constitution for development and growth, how and where we grow, we know what are those places, what are those neighborhoods that we want to take extra care to preserve or reinvest in their historic character, and which may not have historic resources and could be a target for new development, and at the same time also inform the review of development projects and the zoning applications that we get as a planning department, that again, we are informed what and where our historic places are, so we don't have surprises to developers or to the city at the 11th hour when there's a last-minute controversy about demolishing or adversely affecting a historic resource.
Right. So you wander around the city of LA. What buildings do you look at and just go, this is amazing? Do you have a favorite?
I can't do a favorite.
It's
like choosing one's favorite child in that sense. So it's hard. And I think the wonderful aspect of my job is I do get to see, special places in every community of the city, and that was, I think, one of the great. And we knew this going in, but it was one of the great lessons of Survey LA, that every neighborhood in Los Angeles is rich with historic places and places with tremendous cultural resources. So it's hard to choose one, and I think one of the reasons it's hard to do that is, we have, for example, 35 historic districts in the city, and many people don't know that. 35 what are called historic preservation overlay zones, which are entire neighborhoods that have tremendous architectural or cultural significance. And they stretch from the far north end of the San Fernando Valley, a district I love, the Balboa Highlands neighborhood, which is a mid-century modern neighborhood from the early 1960s, down to two in the harbor in the Vinegar Hill neighborhood of San Pedro and Banning Park in Wilmington, and neighborhoods everywhere in between. So I think, to me, what's special about Los Angeles is just the vastness and diversity of all of our historic resources. So it's especially hard in LA to say, I'm going to pick one or just a few.
No, it would be almost impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so spread out, Of those 35 historic preservation overlay zones, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. How did the committee decide what those were?
That really is a grassroots effort. It kind of emanates from the ground up, from the community itself. The community deciding that they think that their neighborhood is unique and worthy of designation, recognition, and does provide, of course, additional protection and review of proposed development projects and changes in those communities. So our role really is that of a partner, really working with those communities to advance those neighborhoods for historic district HPOZ status. And as I said, we've grown the program significantly, about 35 neighborhoods, about 21,000 properties in those communities. That said, I think for those who are concerned, well, we're going to designate the whole city as historic, that still represents just a little over 2% of the city, because we have 880,000 properties citywide. That was the universe of what we had to take in and consider for Survey LA as we made our way through the city. So our HPOZs, our historic districts, are still about 2 to 2.5% of the city.
It's when you put it like that, it's a very small number,
Right.
The African-American historic places.
Yes.
Okay, what is that? You had a kickoff recently for that.
We did, and this is really kind of a outgrowth and continuation of some of the work we did with Getty on Survey LA, and really looking at more broadly at issues of equity and inclusion in historic preservation. And despite all the work that we've done on our Historic Cultural Monument program, on Survey LA to identify historic resources, still there's a tremendous disparity in what gets designated in the city. The vast majority of our historic cultural monuments over the last 6 decades have been sites that have architectural significance primarily. And we have not, despite the fact that our program allows for it, always been as inclusive. Only about 4% of our historic cultural monuments reflect associations with African American history in the city. And so we wanted to really be intentional about rectifying those disparities. So African American Historic Places is a further partnership with Getty. It's being led by Rita Cofield, who is both embedded in our Office of Historic Resources and an employee of the Getty. She is a project leader who comes with rich experience in her own community in Watts, designating as a historic cultural monument the Mafundi Cultural Center, the Watts Happening Cultural Center, and Watts Coffee House, a very significant arts and community center in the Watts community. And she's now helping us lead this project to designate additional historic cultural monuments with African American heritage, to expand upon a framework for African American history called a historic context statement that helps guide the future identification and designation of African American heritage sites, and then also developing cultural preservation strategies to celebrate and interpret history in partnership with at least 3 historically African American neighborhoods of the city. We just kicked off the African American Historic Places Project officially with the first public event this past month at St. Elmo Village, which is a wonderful cultural and arts center in the Mid-City neighborhood. And we were honored that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar actually was our featured speaker, and he himself has been very passionate about preserving African American heritage and has a deep connection to Central Avenue and its jazz history. And we collected community stories. We had a community storytelling event there to collect stories and memories from community elders and longtime community activists about some of the sites that we hope to feature in the project. So we're very excited about the direction of the project to, again, really look more deeply and be more intentional about equity and inclusion in historic preservation.
So once something is designated as historic and sort of has that hanging on it, what happens then? I mean, you mentioned with the African American Historic Places Project, is it the same for all projects?
Yeah, historic cultural monument designation or a historic district like an HPOZ does provide additional review of proposed changes or alterations. Contrary to popular belief, it doesn't mean if a building is designated as a city landmark historic cultural monument in LA that it can never be demolished. It actually can.
Oh, it can.
But it's a much higher bar. There's a hurdle of additional review by the Cultural Heritage Commission. Also in California, preparation of an environmental impact report under our state environmental law, and looking at alternatives to demolition and the feasibility of those alternatives. So it creates a public process under which, again, about managing change, right? So it's about being thoughtful about what change is acceptable and what isn't, and creates a public process to evaluate those types of changes. Designation also does entitle property owners, for those properties that are locally designated, to a financial incentive program that our office operates that's called the Mills Act Historical Property Contract Program. It's a contract voluntarily entered into between a property owner of a historic property and the city that can result in property tax savings. Again, so that historic preservation isn't only about the stick, telling people what they can't do, that there's a carrot associated with that as well, and that we're helping to make preservation more financially feasible, because often historic buildings do take constant upkeep and reinvestment, rehabilitation, to make sure that they continue to exemplify the historic associations for which they're designated.
Well, especially here in earthquake country,
there's
got to be endless amounts of money being put into even current structures that need to be brought up to code.
Yeah, so seismic issues and seismic retrofitted buildings, that's a big issue. We have some seismic mandates as well now, some of the code upgrades. That's going to be an increasing challenge in the years and decades to come as we continue to deal with that.
Always. You wrote a book.
I did.
As I just seamlessly segue into that. It's a gorgeous book. It's Preserving Los Angeles, How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities. It's beautiful inside and out, and it's very well researched. Was this something that you had been working on for years, or did you just finally say, you know what, I've got all this knowledge, let's put it in a book?
It was more the latter, and the research really was more of an outgrowth of my work with the city and really trying to showcase the work that collectively, and again, this wasn't about me, again, we have an incredible team at the Office of Historic Resources that has really done the work. I'm just providing some strategic guidance and direction, but really wanted to showcase the collective work that we've done in Los Angeles, and this, as the subtitle says, also talk more broadly about how historic preservation, historic places can be a positive force for change in cities. And it was really, this was my weekend project, so I of course have kept my busy full-time job with the city,
yes.
and so this was my side project for about 2 years, and really wanting to kind of channel my own continued fascination with Los Angeles and the places I get to see and experience in my work. I have this great bird's eye view of the city and of historic preservation, and to kind of share that with a wider audience. And so the book has over 300 full-color photos because, again, can't pick just one place. It really is about the totality and showcasing that every community in the city has these remarkable historic places that we've identified through Survey LA. So again, each of the 35 plan areas of the city have a section of the book with some of their special historic places, and then also showcasing, again, how our historic cultural monument program, our historic districts, and the work that we've done around equity and inclusion, how that has been transforming communities in the city, and really making a strong statement that often it is the communities that have the highest concentration of historic resources where we're making investments in historic preservation. Those are the communities where we're seeing some of the most positive changes across the city.
Interesting. That you also have an Indigenous peoples historic context statement for the city. What is that?
We're just beginning work on that, and that is really recognizing that that has been a glaring oversight in terms of our historic preservation program. We have primarily focused on the built environment and what I call maybe above ground historic resources, and we have not, even in Survey LA, that was our focus, and we have not taken comprehensive stock of the places associated with the first peoples of Los Angeles and our tribal cultural resources, which may be below ground and often are sensitive historic sites that we have to deal with a little bit differently. There's confidentiality considerations. So we're just beginning to engage with some of our key local tribes and experts in this field to figure out how we can take the type of framework that we've done for Survey LA and work that we've done with our Latino communities, many of our Asian American communities. We did a similar historic framework, historic context statement for LGBT history that was the first of its kind of any city in the country. How do we begin to, again, kind of rectify some of these disparities and begin to more comprehensively deal with the places that are important and meaningful to the first peoples of Los Angeles. Again, we're just early in that project and with some of that engagement, so that's about a 2-year effort for us, and we look forward to, I hope, what will be a very meaningful finished product that will help the city better manage our relationships with the tribes, again, help to rectify much of the unfortunate history that has been related to the first peoples of the city, and to really guide our planning work and our consultations with the tribes moving forward about places that matter to those communities.
I mean, there are the obvious places like the San Gabriel Mission. There's missions and that sort of thing all over Southern California, but you're going even before that.
That's
because we look at the missions and go, wow, that place is ancient. When
there was a pre-colonial history, and we want to begin,
that.
and we need to better understand that history. And again, all too often, our narratives, even when we have nominations that go to our Cultural Heritage Commission, often it starts with 1781 and the colonial history, and it can't start there. We need to have a much more comprehensive and holistic understanding of our real history, and make sure that in our historic preservation program we're telling all of the LA stories, the stories of all of our communities, and not only the triumphal stories of the city, but the aspects of our past that are challenging and difficult, that our historic preservation program needs to reflect all of those stories and those perspectives.
You see this a lot in the South, and I spoke to someone who is working on a preservation project in the South. Your complicated history is even more difficult to tell. You have to be just like double down on the sensitivity because it is so complex, and you don't want to have to face it. But when you do, all these beautiful things come up, you know?
And we're trying to do that, and we've struggled with that over the years, and at times we've had issues where the difficult aspects of our past The desire has been maybe just to wipe it away. We had a very difficult debate several years ago around Parker Center, the former LAPD headquarters in the city, and that was a site that was very important to the history of the LAPD and policing. But it had a very ugly past. Chief Parker himself was not progressive in his racial views. Certainly the practices of the LAPD during this period were harmful to many of the communities in the city. And Parker Center itself also resulted from wholesale clearance of a portion of the Little Tokyo community and the displacement of many Japanese Americans. So do you preserve a site like that that helps tell the often difficult aspects of the past? Or do you wipe it away? Ultimately, the decision by the city council at that time was to demolish Parker Center. It's now a vacant lot, but I think there were many, certainly the vice president of our Cultural Heritage Commission, Gail Kennard, wrote an LA Times editorial as to why it's important to preserve even some of these difficult aspects of our past, that preserving sites of difficult memory helps us better understand what happened and helps us understand how we can change as a society moving forward.
Right. Are there initiatives coming up that you are really looking forward to, something that's maybe on the books that hasn't been well advertised at this point?
Well, I will say we've mentioned African-American historic places as well as our Indigenous peoples context. I'll also mention, as a department, we are advancing work on a new adaptive reuse ordinance in the city.
And what's that?
So that goes back to, again, this original program that revitalized downtown back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We're trying to take that citywide in a more concerted way and make it what we call by right, that someone can just go get a building permit and convert a building to housing citywide now, and for all buildings that are 15 years old or older. Adaptive reuse began with more of an emphasis on historic buildings, but we have a new challenge today coming out of the COVID crisis and really the intersection of our housing crisis, our climate crisis, because reusing and recycling buildings, the greenest building is the one that's already built. It can take decades to make up the carbon impact of even the demolition or replacement, even with the greenest new building. But housing, climate, and then the commercial vacancy rate in this city, because we're working differently, we're working at home, coming into the office, maybe only part-time. We have the highest ever commercial vacancy rates in the city. We can unlock much of that commercial office space and convert it into new housing units across the city and enable not only our historic buildings, but some of our buildings perhaps from the 1970s, 1980s, or 90s in the Valley or the West Side to help meet our housing supply crisis and our affordable housing crisis. So that's a new proposed ordinance that we'll be bringing to our City Planning Commission in the fall of this year.
So you'll have to change zoning to do that.
That is an amendment to the zoning code, and it would be overriding other zoning requirements. But we think that's justified because, again, these buildings are already constructed. They've been in use for decades in many cases. They can't necessarily meet all the current zoning requirements, because they're built, and we want to basically reuse what we have and just to repurpose them for housing. These are buildings that have been well accepted in communities. And so I think the early feedback we've gotten on this has been very positive.
That's good, yeah. All right, Ken, if people want to get more information about what's going on in your office, about historic preservation, is there a website they can log on to?
There are actually two I can give you. One is our planning department website, which is planning.lacity.org, and the Office of Historic Resources portion, there's a drop-down menu under historic preservation that has all the information on our program. But then we also have a comprehensive inventory of historic places in the city called Historic Places LA, and that's at historicplacesla.org, and that's a searchable and mappable website that has all of the resources, even beyond what's in the book, everything we discovered through Survey LA, as well as all of our designated historic resources in every community. So I encourage people to explore Historic Places LA.
That's great. Ken Bernstein, thank you so much for coming on today. So glad to have you. Such a pleasure to learn more about historic LA. Appreciate you coming down.
Oh, thanks so much.
All right, and that's a wrap on LA Currents. I'm Pulice. We'll see you next time.